Bibles this evening back to the Old Testament. That's where we're going to be spending the majority of our time for this lesson. You might even consider it more of a history lesson than most of your average sermons. But as we've looked at some of the kings of Israel, and then of course after the kingdom divided to Israel and Judah, one that we haven't described yet is Joash. In various places he's also referred to as Joash, which is the same name, just an alternate spelling, alternate pronunciation. But I want to examine his reign over Judah. This is, of course, after the kingdom had been split, after Saul, David, and Solomon. I want to look at the circumstances as to how he became king, and really what we see in his life is a chance for revival. At this time, the people of Judah had an opportunity to be revived, to come back to God. A revival is that time where someone renews their life, makes things right, cleans up their act. They had an opportunity here to do just that, to change things up, because we see it's very much the end of an era of what they have been doing and who was in power. And now when Joash comes into play, a lot of things can, and as we'll see, did change for the better, but we'll get a more clear picture of exactly how it happened and what happened as we go through. But just to start out, we find his reign accounted for us in 2 Kings and also over in 2 Chronicles. In 2 Kings chapter 11, it says "Now when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal family. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were being put to death, and she put him and his nurse in a bedroom. Thus they hid him from Athaliah so that he was not put to death. And he remained with her 6 years, hidden in the house of the Lord, while Athaliah reigned over the land. But in the 7th year, Jehoiada sent and brought the captains of the Kerites and of the guards, and had them come to him in the house of the Lord. And he made a covenant with them, and put them under oath in the house of the Lord, and he showed them the king's son." And then over in 2 Chronicles, if you turn there to chapter 24, it says that Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah of Beersheba. And Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. Jehoiada got for him 2 wives, and he had sons and daughters. So as far as the kings of Israel and Judah go, if we were to stack him up against others, it's not sounding all that bad. He reigned for 40 years. Some reigned for less than a week, it seems. He reigned for quite a while, and it says that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and that's more than you can say for a lot of the kings. So it sounds like what we have here is a good king. And again, it's this idea where things could really change for the better. Not only the king, but the land overall could have this big turnaround, that they could have a revival and be coming back to God. But one of the things that we've already noticed in the reading, whether you took notice of it or not, we're going to go over it once again. But one of the things we see in his account is that he is unique in how he came to power and the circumstances in which he became king. He says he was only 7 years old. Now, he wasn't the only child king that we have recorded for us. We know Josiah wasn't very old either. But Joash was certainly different because he really, when you think of it that way, he had the odds, we would say, stacked against him. The odds that he would even be alive were not very good considering what had been happening, and certainly the odds of him having a long reign, a healthy, prosperous reign, you wouldn't think that would be what would happen to Joash. But if you noticed there, as we read in 2 Kings chapter 11, and we're going to read over in 2 Chronicles 22, we see that his father, who was king before him, Ahaziah, he was killed. And when his mother saw that he was killed, as we read before, she wiped out the rest of the royal family. Her own family, her own descendants. Joash, of course, is her grandson, and she would have had him killed as well if it weren't for the intervention to save his life. But the entire royal family wiped out. And this is, again, unique in all the history of the kingdom. We see all these kings of Israel and Judah. But for this about 7-year period, there is a queen reigning over Judah. And of course, we know that she was a wicked individual. The fact that she had the rest of the royal family killed tells you that much. But we see not only that, not only was he almost killed and barely escaped with his life, if it wasn't for the intervention of his aunt and for, as we're going to see, Jehoiada the priest, but we see not only that, his father was a wicked king himself. So is it any surprise we see what his mother did? We see how her reign was. But over in 2 Chronicles chapter 22, it says there, "And the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah his youngest son king in his place, for the band of men that came with the Arabians to the camp had killed all the older sons. So Ahaziah the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, reigned. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri. He also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor in doing wickedly. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, as the house of Ahab had done. For after the death of his father, they were his counselors to his undoing." And, generally when we look at the scriptures, we look at the line of kings, we see how these things go. Most of the time, if one was wicked, their son rising to power in their place would be just as wicked. So we see his father being wicked, and he learns that from his mother. So his grandmother doesn't walk in the ways of the Lord. They're following after King Ahab, who is not only an evil king of Israel, but perhaps the worst king out of all of them. But yet here, Joash, despite his grandmother, despite his father, we see the way he is raised for those 7 years. And he is ready, we'll use that term loosely, to become a good king, to do what is right. So despite his background, usually that's one of the things we level against people. We know where they come from. We know who their parents are. And we take that into consideration. But we shouldn't do that. We need to be able to look at someone, listen to what they say, see what they're doing, and judge that on its own merits. And again, bringing up the fact that he was only 7 years old. How many of us would trust a 7-year-old to know what is right, to know what makes sense in running of this nation, in ruling over these people? How easy would it have been for one of his own people, some of the noble class there of Judah, or a foreign king, someone who wanted the power, wanted the top of the country, to come in, pressure him, assassinate him? Kind of thing happens all the time, right? Political intrigue, all these kingdoms. But yet, that didn't happen. Back in 2 Kings chapter 11, we see how he came to power. Down in verse 11 it says, "And the guards stood, every man with his weapons in his hand, from the south side of the house to the north side of the house, around the altar and the house, on behalf of the king. Then he brought out the king's son and put the crown on him and gave him the testimony. And they proclaimed him king and anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, 'Long live the king.' When Athaliah heard the noise of the guard and of the people, she went into the house of the Lord to the people. And when she looked, there was the king standing by the pillar according to the custom, and the captains and the trumpeters beside the king, and all the people of the land rejoicing and blowing trumpets. And Athaliah tore her clothes and cried, 'Treason! Treason!' Then Jehoiada the priest commanded the captains who were set over the army, 'Bring her out between the ranks and put to death with the sword anyone who follows her.' For the priest said, 'Let her not be put to death in the house of the Lord.' So they laid hands on her, and she went through the horse's entrance to the king's house, and there she was put to death." So they keep him in hiding for these 7 years. He's being raised there in the house of the Lord in secret. And there, in the 7th year, they reveal him to some of the guard. They keep him guarded because they're not sure what's going to happen. They don't know how the people are going to react to it. And fortunately for them, the people were on their side when they do reveal him, when they're bringing him out, proclaiming that this is the king's son, that he is the rightful heir to the throne. But even though the people react well to it, that's all the more reason why Athaliah, who had appointed herself as queen, would react badly to it. She knows she doesn't want this to happen. This is exactly why she had killed all the rest of the royal family, to try to seize the power for herself. But again, we see how far it got her. So even though he had the odds against him, we see that Joash not only survives, but is crowned king 7 years old. These people happy to have him as king, ready to submit to his rule. So what do we see going on after that fact? We understand what happened with his father and his grandmother in that strange period where there was this queen reigning over Judah, leading the people into even further idolatry. She's the one, of course, who instructed her son to do the same. But we see the main thing with Joash, the reason why it says he walked in the ways of the Lord, walked in a way that is pleasing to the Lord, is because he had a good instructor. He had a mentor, a father figure, if you would. He had someone to guide him. This individual, Jehoiada the priest, probably the one who did the majority of raising him in those 7 years. He taught him, and while Joash was still a very, very young child, helped him to rule over the people, helped him to make the decisions necessary as king. We see in 2 Chronicles chapter 23, starting with verse 16, it says, "And Jehoiada made a covenant between himself and all the people and the king, that they should be the Lord's people. Then all the people went to the house of Baal and tore it down. His altars and his images they broke in pieces, and they killed Mattan the priest of Baal before the altars. And Jehoiada posted watchmen for the house of the Lord under the direction of the Levitical priests and the Levites, whom David had organized to be in charge of the house of the Lord, to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, as it is written in the law of Moses, with rejoicing and with singing, according to the order of David. He stationed the gatekeepers at the gates of the house of the Lord, so that no one should enter who was in any way unclean. And he took the captains, the nobles, the governors of the people, and all the people of the land, and they brought the king down from the house of the Lord, marching through the upper gate to the king's house. And they set the king on the royal throne. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet, after Athaliah had been put to death with the sword." So Joash, of course, can't do this on his own. He needs someone to look out for him, someone to protect him, and that person, that individual, is this priest, Jehoiada. And we see the very first thing that he does there in verse 16. After they had put Athaliah, after they had put the woman who had appointed herself as queen to death, the very first thing he does is form a covenant. He made a covenant between himself and all the people and the king. And if we understand what a covenant is and what its purpose is, a covenant is a contractual relationship. It is a special relationship. It is a special bond. We see it with us and the Lord. We see it in the marriage relationship. We understand how that works. So when it says he made a covenant between himself and the people and the king, there's the three parties there. We're kind of understanding what he's getting at, that I'm going to do my part to help serve, that he's going to guide the king, he's going to do what he can to help the people, but with the understanding he's not trying to take the power for himself, because he's including the king in this. He is not taking the throne away, he's just there to guide, he is just there to help. And once Joash would grow old enough, once he would be able to do this on his own, then Jehoiada would be out of the picture. But you notice that's not all it says. Yes, they make this covenant, and yes, it's between the three people, himself, the king, and the people at large. But he says there in the covenant that they should be the Lord's people. And this is where we're getting at, that they had an opportunity here to turn things around. They had an opportunity to make a change, not just a change in rulership, not just going from the queen to a king, from this old woman to this 7-year-old boy. A much more important, a much more distinct change, that now they are going to be God's people. They had had his father in power. They had had the past 7 years with his grandmother in power. They've been serving the Baals. They had wandered away from God. It tells you a whole lot about how little they were serving the Lord, that they were able to keep Joash hidden in the temple this whole time. If anyone would have bothered to go in there, was really interested in worshiping the Lord, you think they would have found him. You think someone would have noticed that there's this little boy living in there. But no one did. That tells us an awful lot about the state of the people. So he makes a covenant here, not only of what the arrangement is going to be, but included in that is that they would be the Lord's people. That they're to follow him. That they belong to him. And the wonderful thing is they don't only agree with it. Talk is cheap. They don't just say, well, yes, yes, we will follow the Lord. It's followed up with action. They go in, they destroy the altars of Baal. They take all of that away. So they're showing willingness to change. They're putting forth effort here to do what Jehoiada is telling them they need to do. And of course we have to understand the impact this would have on Joash. That this man that you've known pretty much all your life, that now he's bringing you up, he's telling you you're going to be in power, and what's the first thing he does? He gets rid of the idols. He's telling the people they need to be the Lord's people. That had to make an impact on him. You don't easily forget that. So this is the man that he has to guide him, to give him counsel, to help him out in any way that he needs. And of course we see with him there helping Joash that they make several reforms. Not only do they get rid of all the altars of Baal, not only do they stop that, but we see, starting with verse 4 of the next chapter, chapter 24, it says, after this, Joash decided to restore the house of the Lord. And he gathered the priests and the Levites and said to them, go out to the cities of Judah and gather from all Israel money to repair the house of your God from year to year, and see that you act quickly. But the Levites did not act quickly. So the king summoned Jehoiada the chief and said to him, why have you not required the Levites to bring in from Judah and Jerusalem the tax levied by Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the congregation of Israel for the tent of testimony? For the sons of Athaliah, that wicked woman, had broken into the house of God, and had also used all the dedicated things of the house of the Lord for the Baals. So the king commanded, and they made a chest and set it outside the gate of the house of the Lord. And proclamation was made throughout Judah and Jerusalem to bring in for the Lord the tax that Moses, the servant of God, laid on Israel in the wilderness. And all the princes and all the people rejoiced and brought their tax and dropped it into the chest until they had finished. And whenever the chest was brought to the king's officers by the Levites, when they saw that there was much money in it, the king's secretary and the officer of the chief priest would come and empty the chest and take it and return it to its place. Thus they did day after day and collected money in abundance. And the king and Jehoiada gave it to those who had charge of the work of the house of the Lord, and they hired masons and carpenters to restore the house of the Lord, and also workers in iron and bronze to repair the house of the Lord. So those who were engaged in the work labored, and the repairing went forward in their hands, and they restored the house of God to its proper condition and strengthened it. And when they had finished, they brought the rest of the money before the king and Jehoiada, and with it were made utensils for the house of the Lord, both for the service and for the burnt offerings, and dishes for incense, and vessels of gold and silver. And they offered burnt offerings in the house of the Lord regularly all the days of Jehoiada. So we see not only did he tear down all the altars of Baal, but he doesn't stop there. He fixes the temple, because the temple had grown into disrepair. The people who, when they were worshiping Baal, when they were involved in all of that, they ransacked the Lord's temple, taking all of the gold, all the silver, all of those things that were supposed to be holy, supposed to be dedicated towards God. In our scripture reading, we've been going through Exodus and Leviticus. It outlined what these things were for. No one was supposed to be able to touch them except for the priests and the Levites who were specifically appointed to carry those things, to use them. And yet here they went in just doing what they pleased. But what's really interesting about this account, the way we read it, is that we really don't see Jehoiada involved until Joash talks to him. So as we've been talking here about Joash coming to power, and he's only 7 years old when he approaches the throne, and Jehoiada serving kind of like a regent with him, helping him to rule, we might get stuck in that thought process that, well, he's just kind of holding his hand while he does all of this. Initially, yes. But right here, that's not what we're seeing. If you notice where we started there in verse 4, it says, after this, Joash decided to restore the house of the Lord. Those two words, after this, are a little confounding because they let us know that it's later, but they don't give us any kind of time frame. We have no idea how much time has taken place, how much time has transpired between when he took the throne and then now when he says he's going to do this. Is he still a young child? Maybe. Maybe he's a teenager. We just don't know. But however old he is, he decides by himself that this is something that needs doing, this is something that is worth doing. And so he goes and he commands the priests and the Levites that this is what they're going to do. And then when they don't take him seriously enough, maybe that's the reason. We're not told why, but he told them to hurry. He told them to act quickly, and they didn't. They just kind of let it go. When he sees that it's not getting done, then he calls in Jehoiada, and he says, we need to get on this. So it's not that he's being told what to do, that he's just a puppet, and Jehoiada is the real power behind the throne. No. Joash on his own says, we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. And he makes these reforms to clean up, to repair the temple. So he started to reign, and he's doing what is right. Because he had this good guidance. Because he had Jehoiada there to help him. Someone that he could count on. Someone who could let him know what they needed to do. He knew what needed fixed in the land. He knew they had to get rid of the Baals. And he knew they had to fix the temple. This is the way it's supposed to be according to the law. This isn't right. We can't just let it go. So he taxes the people. And again, there's something that we need to take from this. In verse 10, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but it says that all the princes and all the people rejoiced and brought their tax and dropped it into the chest until they had finished. How many of us rejoice over paying taxes? No one. It's annoying. We don't like it. It's frustrating. And we feel that it's taking away our money. It's probably because we don't agree with the things that the taxes are being used for. And even if we did agree, we would do it grudgingly most of the time, right? But it says the people were happy to do it. Happy to give. Why would the people be happy to give? Now, it doesn't tell us. It doesn't spell it out word for word explicitly as to why the people were rejoicing, but we can read from the context. We see what's going on here. We know why this tax was being levied, to repair the house of the Lord. And we're told that proclamations were made, so they didn't just come out, hold the people at the point of the sword and say, you're going to pay some taxes. They explained to them what these taxes were for and what they were going to be used for. And then it says the people were happy to do it. This shows that the effect that Joash, thanks to his bringing up, thanks to his guidance from Jehoiada the priest, they see that if this is important to the king, if this is what the king says, this is what the king wants, that it started with him, this revival, but it's spreading to the people. They can see, well, yeah, we need to fix the temple. They got involved. They got passionate about it. So they were happy to give. They were rejoicing that they could be involved, that they could be a part of repairing the house of the Lord. And it's a wonderful thing. And it's one of a few different times throughout their history where we see the people having this period of revival. And when we consider this, try to make application for ourselves, how valuable is good counsel, wise advice, someone there who is older, wiser. You can't put a price tag on that. To have someone there that you can go to, that they'll let you know, well, here's what the Scriptures have to say. And more or less, that's the role that Jehoiada filled. He is a priest. He knows the law inside and out. There is no one better. If you have a question as to how I'm going to rule these people, what does the Lord want from me, to go to than him. It's exactly what he was supposed to be, and that's exactly the role that he played. So for us today, when we have a question in our lives, whether it's regarding our place in the church or just regarding life in general, whom do we turn to? Who are we asking about advice in our job, in our relationships? Do we have anybody that we feel comfortable going to them? I would certainly hope so. And if we don't, before we are quick to say, well, I just don't have anybody, before we just throw up our arms and lament that there's no one around, maybe ask the question, is it my fault that no one comes to me, that no one talks to me? Is it my fault that I don't feel comfortable enough with someone to ask them for advice? We might be guilty of walling ourselves off from the world. Maybe it's out of fear. Maybe it's out of pride. Maybe we're too proud to ask for help or admit that we don't have all the answers. You know, good help, good advice, it's hard to come by. We need to snatch it up when we have it. We need to not be afraid to admit that we might need some help, or that it might at least be good for us to get someone else's thoughts on this, to pick their brain on it. Yeah, we might not be little helpless 7-year-olds thrown into the deep end, in over our heads, trying to run a nation. But that doesn't mean we know everything. And it doesn't mean that we're always going to get it right on the first try. The fact that he had this man, the fact that Jehoiada was there to help him, not only helped him, it helped the entire nation. We can see this effect, the ripple effect of how it goes out, how all the people are now benefiting and in so much a better place of being God's people, really all due to him. But, all that having been said, we come to the point in the story where it takes a turn. That even though he had a rough start, he had someone that he could count on, he had a good authority figure in his life, someone that he could go to for advice, for counsel, it just wasn't enough. From everything we've seen so far, clearly Jehoiada had had an effect on Joash. He had influenced him. He had taught him. Joash knew right from wrong. There's no debating that. Again, it's not that he was just a puppet and just going along with whatever Jehoiada had said. Joash was making these decisions himself. So he knew. He had been taught. And he would be fully accountable for his actions. And it's so much like the verse says, train up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he will not depart from it. Well, that's a truism. It's true most of the time, but you can't count on just having a good teacher that someone is going to turn out exactly the way they should. And this story is one of so many from the Scriptures that show us how quickly things can change. And a lot of times we marvel at that. We're just awestruck at how quickly God's people turned around and abandoned him. You know, when they were wandering in the wilderness, these people who had seen the 10 plagues, seen all of this, how quickly they were to grumble and complain against God and say that they'd rather go back to Egypt. And we wonder about that. And we see it again in the period of the Judges. Within one generation, they go from being saved by God and vowing that they're going to serve the Lord to again following after idols. And here we see it in less than one generation. Here is someone who, as he was being brought up, was taught about God, taught right from wrong. And when he became king, he made these reforms. He tore down the Baals. He restored the house of the Lord. This is a promising young man. But look at what we see starting with verse 15 there of chapter 24. It says, "But Jehoiada grew old and full of days, and died. He was 130 years old at his death. And they buried him in the city of David among the kings because he had done good in Israel and toward God and his house. Now after the death of Jehoiada, the princes of Judah came and paid homage to the king. Then the king listened to them. And they abandoned the house of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and served the Asherim and the idols. And wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem for this guilt of theirs. Yet he sent prophets among them to bring them back to the Lord. These testified against them, but they would not pay attention. Then the Spirit of God clothed Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest, and he stood above the people and said to them, Thus says God, Why do you break the commandments of the Lord, so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, He has forsaken you. But they conspired against him, and by command of the king, they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord. Thus Joash the king did not remember the kindness that Jehoiada, Zechariah's father, had shown him, but killed his son. And when he was dying, he said, May the Lord see and avenge. Amazing to think that things could happen so quickly. And again, we're not given a time frame. We see those two words again. After this, after the death of Jehoiada, we don't know how long. It just doesn't say. But this man who had been such an important figure in his life and had helped him out so much, now that he has died, who comes along? The princes of Judah, right? The leaders of the people. But clearly, they weren't as changed as maybe we've been led to believe. You know, we thought, when it talks about them gladly bringing in these taxes, we thought all the people were on board. They see the changes that Jehoiada is talking about, that Joash is talking about. Now all the people want to come back to God. But if that were the case, they would continue in that fashion. But it tells us that after Jehoiada died, and now they come in and they're the counselors, they're giving all this advice to the king, we see exactly where their advice leads. Because the king listened to them. They abandon God and they start following after idols. But that's not the worst part. God sends a prophet to them. He sends them Zechariah, who is the son of Jehoiada. And he tells them exactly what's going wrong, exactly why that's the case. And they don't listen. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is that they kill him. But not just kill him. In verse 21 it said, by command of the king. It would be one thing if it was just a crowd, right? Just a rabble of people, mob mentality, just being caught up in the moment, and all that violence happening, someone being killed. Like when Stephen was stoned. But that's not what it says. By command of the king. Joash didn't like what he had to say. So he commanded that they shut him up permanently. The son of the man that he knew, loved and respected. You know, we would think in our lives that even if he didn't like what Zechariah was saying, even if Zechariah's words and his prophecies were hurting his reign, making him look bad in the eyes of the people and various things like that, that he would at least show a little bit of kindness to him for the sake of his father. But we don't see even that. So now this man who tore down the altars of Baal, made all these sweeping changes in the kingdom, taxed the people to repair the house of God, he's ordering murder. Ordering this man, the prophet of the Lord, to be killed. Because now he's got a new group of advisors. Now he's choosing to listen to them and not, again, what he knows to be right. There is no doubt at this point that he's old enough to be making his own decisions. That he knows the difference between right and wrong. Just as much as we can't say, well, it was Jehoiada guiding him and that's what made him good in the first place. We can't let him get off scot-free for this and say, well, it's because of those princes of Judah. And they were advising him, and he listened to them, and so it's really their fault. He chose to take their advice. He chose to listen to it. No, he's clearly the one at fault here. Having that good guidance, having that good upbringing, it's not enough. Because at a certain point, we need to take responsibility for our lives and the things that we do. And of course, again, we see just how far it got him. It says, at the end of the year, verse 23, the army of the Syrians came up against Joash. They came to Judah and Jerusalem and destroyed all the princes of the people from among the people and sent all their spoil to the king of Damascus. Though the army of the Syrians had come with few men, the Lord delivered into their hand a very great army, because Judah had forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers. Thus they executed judgment on Joash. When they departed from him, leaving him severely wounded, his servants conspired against him because of the blood of the son of Jehoiada, the priest, and killed him on his bed. So he died, and they buried him in the city of David, but they did not bury him in the tombs of the kings. Those who conspired against him were Zabad, the son of Shemath, the Ammonite, and Jehozabad, the son of Shimrith, the Moabite. And that's how his reign ends. 40 years. And it all comes down to that. He answered for the blood of Zechariah, for the man that he had killed. But after all of that, after 40 years, being assassinated by his servants, they don't bury him with the kings because of the type of man he was. Because even though he had a chance here to change the people, and it looks like he started to, he didn't follow through. We see he wasn't given that kind of respect. Such a stark contrast to Jehoiada. Jehoiada, we're told, was a priest. He wasn't the king. But he was buried with the kings because of all the good that he had done. We see his legacy. But we also see the legacy of Joash. They had a chance here for not just him, but for all the people to have a revival, to be brought back to God, to be right where they needed to be. But it didn't happen. It didn't fully materialize. And why? Because of the advice that he chose to take. Because even though he was brought up right, even though he knew what he needed to do, at a certain point, once Jehoiada was gone, it didn't matter. It's sad to think, but there are probably a number of individuals who in their lives are doing things right before God, attending worship services, praying, singing. And they do this because they know it's expected of them. They know it's what their family wants. And sadly, I think there's a lot of instances where once the parents are gone, those ones will wander away from the Lord. Maybe not even give it a second thought. It's sad to think about. And it's tragic, really. There's no other way to put it. But it happened here. And we know there's nothing new under the sun. The same thing. It still happened today. All it takes is for that one person to be gone. Now, yes, just because they died doesn't make their words any less true. We all understand that. But we as human beings, we tend to justify things to ourselves and rationalize. So we do it to honor them, but only for a while. Once they're gone, once we no longer have them there to be that good influence on our lives, and we have to stand on our own, then we find out really how strong we are and what kind of faith we have. So what could have been this huge turning point for the kingdom of Judah. Yes, by and large, the southern kingdom of Judah was a lot more righteous than the northern kingdom of Israel. That's true. They weren't nearly as bad as Ahab and all of those kings. But still, they could have done so much here. But fell short. They didn't get there. A 40-year reign. Like we said, it's a pretty long reign compared to a lot of kings. But at the end of it, what does he have to show for it? The people are no better off than when he started. They're back following idols. He's not even buried with the kings. And the house of the Lord abandoned again. All it takes is one man to effect change. Change for the better. But all it takes is one man to undo all of that. It's an important lesson for us today. In our lives, at any given moment, we might have a chance to make a change. It doesn't have to be what we would consider a watershed moment, like a birth or a marriage or a graduation or anything like that. It could be any given day that we have an opportunity to turn things around, to make our lives better, to bring ourselves closer to God. And I hope we jump on those opportunities. I hope, as the Scriptures say, we make the most of the time. We redeem the time. But if we're not careful, we let those opportunities pass us by. And just as much as we need to be out in the world being that salt of the earth, being the light of the world, being that good example, and one person can do so much to influence others for good. One word that we say before others. A lie. Hypocrisy. Cursing. Vulgarity. Think of how much good that one act, that one word can undo in a moment. It changes, certainly does, but not the way it needs to be, and not the way we want it to. In our lives, we all have to understand the change that we need to make to come back to God, to be reconciled to Him. And all of this is possible because of Jesus, because of His death on the cross, because of the love that He had for us. And that's the change that we need to make. So if there's any tonight who need to put on Christ, need to become children of God, you have time and opportunity to do that. But for those who are Christians, those who are members of the body of Christ, if there's something in your life that you're doing that you know God has commanded against, or there's something that He has told you that you need to do, that you're lacking, that you've been letting that fall by the wayside, there's time to change that tonight. It's that time for revival, to be made alive, to be made strong again. And if there's sin in your life, repent of that. We'll pray with you, we'll pray for you, if that's the case. But if there needs to be a change made, make it. Don't wait. Don't put it off. Don't assume that you'll be able to handle it later, because we're not promised tomorrow. If you're subject to the Lord's invitation, think on these things. If you have spiritual needs, repent. Come, have a seat on the front while we stand, while we sing.